Hello my fellow rodent lovers. Are you looking for ways to make your warband of furry friends more deadly? Or do you want to know more about the ratkin and how to get the most out of them? Fear not. My name's Hydra and I will be talking and walking you through the Skaven Warband. First up is the Skaven equipment. Of these, the Weeping Blades tend to be the most utilised. They are effectively dual-wield swords that allow for a parry stance and have the chance of applying damaging poison to your opponent. Technically, they're going to be similar to halberds in terms of function, but their poison bypasses armour and they exchange some of the upfront damage for a better initiative value. They also don't suffer from the tiring trait, which lowers damage on subsequent hits in a single turn. So in summary, they're going to be the better option for the majority of your heroes. There is, however, an exception to this rule. If you're building into abilities like Black Hunger, Frenzy, Mighty Charge for example, moves that generate a lot of damage in a single strike, then the halberd is going to be the obvious choice for you as it front loads a lot of its damage. Next up are the Fighting Claws. These handheld weapons provide slight armour penetration and climbing bonuses, which is often seen as inferior to the Weeping Blade's poison. Another potential use is within a crit-based build, as they can be combined with the Skaven passive Art of Silent Death to increase total crit percentage. Generally speaking, you'll only see these on Night Runners who aren't lucky enough to be compatible with the Weeping Blades. Next up we have the Skaven ranged equipment. Let's discuss the reliable Shuriken first. This is a low range, low damage throwing star, but it's compensated for by a small bonus to hit percentage. It isn't deadly on its own, but can be handy to have in the alternate weapon slot of your characters for occasions when you can't get to an enemy's combat circle. Also, they give units a ranged option when low on health and wanting to not risk death. They can also be used to apply some of the unique Skaven poisons, but we'll discuss that more in the next section. Finally, we have the Warp Pistols. These armour-piercing dual pistols have a moderate range and can do some effective damage. Only equipable by your heroes, they are capable of exchanging blows with the human black powder counterparts. Note that they will inherently require a higher ballistic skill to reliably hit compared to the Shuriken. And, as a black powder weapon, they can be costly to reload. Heroes using these weapons will benefit more from the reduced cost of improved reload skills. Okay, so now I bet you want to know more about the poison builds, right? They sound pretty interesting. I'd hope so. Well, it's what being a rat is all about. Let's get into some of the Skaven skills and the things that really make this warband unique. My favourite two abilities in the game include Warp and Numbing Poison. Upon application to a weapon and a successful infection, a la twatting them one, they can remove strategy or combat points from that enemy. I'd suggest these poisons for your ranged units, as mentioned above, because they can hit multiple targets per turn. These poisons can even be combined with Overwatch for a nasty surprise. The fun doesn't even stop there. Combine these poisons with other debuffing abilities like Crippling or Pinning Shot, and they can actually stack, taking away a potential 8 strategy or 8 offensive points once mastered. Remember to include some poison bypass within this, otherwise you may not get the maximal use of these abilities. Next are the melee damage orientated passives of note. Without a doubt, the best value is Swarm. This will give you 2 valuable stats, plus hit and plus crit, but only while engaging an enemy with an ally by your side. This is an obvious choice for any melee, and the plus 5 crit means you get the occasional Brucey bonus of an enemy laying down on the floor, so you can give them a deadly belly rub. Given the low cost of 100 gold, this skill is even affordable for henchmen, and can help compensate for their lower weapon skill in the early campaign. Next up is Black Hunger. This intimidating skill sacrifices some of your hit points and, while a little masochistic, it provides an amazing buff to your damage. But not only that, it also helps bypass a huge chunk of the enemy dodge and parry. I find it's best comboed with skills like Frenzy and Daredevil to boost your damage percentage even higher, then unleashing this damage on a high-scaled skill such as Mighty Charge or Overpower. Trust me, this will deliver one hell of a Falco punch. If going for such builds, I'd also suggest bringing Combat Focus to help bump up your accuracy. Meow. While building all these damage orientated skills, you're going to be a walking executioner, but you're also going to be made of paper, and if using the Frenzy stance you will have no mitigation stances, so don't bite off more than your little rat teeth can chew. For those of you wondering about the Globadier skills, No, I haven't forgotten him, but we're going to discuss this unique character a little bit later, as these skills are unique to the character. On that note, let's move on to the Skaven heroes and what each one of them is suited toward. Starting off with the ogre. Like the other impressives, he's immune to the tiring effects of attacking and can dish out steady damage at the consistent cost of 2 offensive points. This, combined with his high base stats, allow him to pursue a really damage-orientated build. Skill-wise, there's many viable options for him, and likely something that will be discussed in the next video. There are, however, some limitations to the Rat Ogre. Unfortunately, he doesn't wear any form of usable armour, and hence has no real mitigation. In addition to this, he can't parry, due to his lack of weapons, and therefore he requires agility to effectively mitigate any form of damage. Sidestep is of worthy note here, as it will help mitigate multiple attacks per turn, but investing heavily into the agility tree early on can really gimp his damage. Most importantly, the ogre does also suffer from stupidity, which means at the start of every turn when he isn't engaged in combat, he will have to pass a test in order to actually move. Thankfully, there is a way to overcome this. The sorcerer comes out of the box with a free guidance ability found in the leadership tree. This nullifies the effects of stupidity for a couple of turns and can also help traumatise warband members suffering from stupidity. Incredibly helpful. Now, obviously the sorcerer has access to spells as well, otherwise he wouldn't be called a sorcerer, and the Skaven have some real beauties. All of them are viable, although some are much more powerful than others, so what we'll do is we'll go through them in order and discuss them one by one. First up is Blessed with Filth, giving one of your heroes increased damage per hit. Best combined with the Rat Ogre, as it's more of a late game spell, as the units in the game tend to gain more attacks per turn later on in the campaign. Then we have Musk of Courage, granting nearby units immunity to all alone tests. Whilst not the best skill in the world, it does have its place and some potential uses. Next up, Warp Mist, a fart cloud of poison resist, debuffing cabbage-like smelly stuff. Not mandatory, but it can help apply resist reduction, that we talked a little bit about earlier. Next up, Sorcerer's Curse, reducing a single opponent's armour value, potentially allowing you to deal a whopping amount of extra damage if they're heavily armoured. Fantastic skill, I would recommend this to every single sorcerer. Next up, we have Gaze of the Horned Rat, which reduces enemy offensive points around the caster, an AoE debuff, which could potentially swing a big brawl. However, it does come with some risk of having to be close to the actual action. Finally, we have Warp Lightning, which works like an electric blunderbuss and makes you feel like an agent of the dark side, with unlimited power! Bear in mind that, like any sorcerer though, that when put into hand-to-hand combat, you're likely to get poked a couple of times and fall over. Ballistic skill and a pair of pistols are quite handy to keep this guy out of harm's way, especially during the early campaign, when you don't have many spells or skill choices. Now for the 4 non-magic wielding heroes, let's do a side-by-side comparison of the Black Skaven, Night Runner, Globadier and Assassin. All 4 of these heroes have a lot of similarities, but each hero also comes with some unique advantages. First off is the Black Skaven. He's probably the most versatile melee unit out of all 4, with respectable strength, toughness, agility, weapon skill, accuracy, you name it. Feel free to pick your own path with this one. Or if you're having any problems deciding on a build, check out my video on how to build a melee character. Only thing he doesn't really excel at is ranged combat, due to his poor ballistic skill of 9. But to fill this gap, we have the Night Runner, who's more or less the yin to the Black Skaven's yang. Far less flexible in terms of melee combat, and while viable in terms of dodge crit-based builds, he's much better suited towards the range combat, as his higher ballistic skill and warp-lock pistols make for a lovely combination. Now, in between these two we have the Globadier, who's capable of range combat with a modest ballistic skill and his ranged globes, and also viable in terms of utility-based melee build thanks to some of his unique skills. Let's look into those a little bit more now. The ones of particular of note are Vent, reducing enemy hit percentage nearby by 10%, very powerful. Next up is Warp Fumes, buffing his own hit percentage. Again, another very useful skill. Then we have Infused Globe, healing but debuffing your nearby units, which could potentially have some use when engaged in a large cluster. And next and finally we have Strangling Globe, which is great against late game casters, have a few too many spells up their sleeve, bang, nullifies them. So, if you want to be more of a grenade based Globadier, I'd consider also investing into potent globes, which helps bypass some of the enemy poison. And as a little tip for the grenade-based builds, occasionally the AI will not be able to move through the fog and they'll be forced to find another path, creating a potential choke point. Get it? Choke point? Anyone? No? Okay. Finally, the leader. This chap actually is the jack of all trades when it comes to heroes. He's the most balanced out of all of them, capable of more or less any role, combat or ranged, and a multitude of different builds. So do what you like with this guy, but do remember that he is your leader and losing him will really impact your morale. So for this reason, many players choose to keep it safe and go with a ranged option. While discussing our hero builds, you may have noticed none of these rats actually wear heavy armour. This leaves us with the choice, light armour or clothing. Now often it's going to be tempting to forgo the light armour mitigation for extra dodge that the clothing will give you. But I suggest that you remember that you can only dodge while in the dodge stance, so if casually roaming with your heroes around the map you get ambushed, those enemies are going to do some serious damage to you in just a single round of combat. I'd suggest light armour on the heroes whenever possible, especially those that have some parry. Helmets too, as that 5% extra armour really helps mitigate that damage. Also, to help compensate for the hero's lack of tankiness, I like to have a couple of high initiative units in my warband with daggers for the plus initiative boost that can be used as early initiators of enemy heroes to absorb their counterattacks, potentially even to absorb their ambushes and take that frontline damage. Hey, that's what henchmen are for. Sorry, rat. Now, moving on. Not all Skaven are actually restricted to light armour and clothing. We also have Warp Guard. Warp Guard can be turned into Storm Vermin for those of you that have played the tabletop game. Give them some heavy armour, a helmet, a halberd, shield, weapon. These guys can be a much needed frontline. They also don't get debuffs from picking up Weirdstone, which might not sound like a big deal, but when you look at the hidden stat debuffs Weirdstone can apply to you, i.e. -1 offensive point, -10% chance to hit, some of these can actually stack up and really set a character back. So I'd suggest letting some of these guys build into strength so that they can increase their carry capacity for this very purpose. Now let's talk about the Vermkin. At face value they look rubbish. They settle around 4/5 of the stats of their Warp Guard kin, and they don't have access to heavy armour. Well, you're right, they don't look as good. However, they have one advantage over Warp Guards, which is their slightly higher ballistic skill. While obviously the little runt of the litter.
Runt? I said runt?
That extra little bit of ballistic skill can be fairly useful for having a couple, and I really mean only a couple of ranged shuriken wielding, poison applying units that we mentioned earlier. Now onto some more playstyle orientated tips for the Skaven, okay, because playing these guys they are quite unique. Skaven inherently have a larger movement range per strategy point than most warbands. This is something that can be taken advantage of, but can also leave you in a sticky situation if not managed correctly. The most important part of being a rat is that you stick together, not because you like each other, hell no, but because it's safer. Because of this, we have to be wary when purchasing multiple Warp Guards with movement limiting heavy armour, because if you simply rush forward with your heroes towards the nearest Weirdstone at the beginning of the game, you can find yourself left without the appropriate support. This really applies more to the Skaven, because in many warbands the heroes wielding heavy armour but have the extra strategy points can keep up with the henchmen, whereas Skaven have the opposite. The henchmen become even slower, having fewer strategy points and a lower base speed when equipped with the heavy armour. Ways to avoid this are deploying your heavily armoured units closer to the objectives, or during the early game avoiding the armour entirely, just focusing on a high mobility warband. Note that because of this movement range bonus, Skaven are slightly better suited to wide arc deployments, as they can regroup and converge on map points faster than their opponent warband. There's one other slightly less Skaven-like playstyle to consider too, having lots of tanks in heavy armour and just slowly advancing as a unit. If this is the plan, then having ranged heroes is perhaps slightly better suited, as they can get into position with their extra movement. Lastly, on the subject of movement, charge distance is directly proportional to movement range, and therefore you will find that your charge distance as a Skaven is greater than your enemies in most cases. This is really handy to know, as it applies to the henchmen too. As a general rule, try to make sure you ambush the enemy henchmen wherever possible, giving you the advantage of having increased damage and the enemy not having a defensive stance. However, be mindful ambushing heroes without backup, as they can absorb that initial damage and counterattack twice in return, leaving you severely wounded. Be mindful and try and go into a defensive stance when it looks like a hero may be engaging you, but be prepared if he's going to go for one of your weaker units. You may need to use that ambush stance to simply prevent him from engaging. So, now we know a little bit more about Skaven, I hope so. Once again guys, you've been listening to Hydra. Remember to like and subscribe. I'm hoping to try and hit 50 subscribers by the end of this week. I know it's a big ask, but if you can click that button, I would be so damn happy. Take care. See you next time.